Okay, whoever you are that just hit play, I just hit record. Here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. How's it going? What are you doing right now? Are you driving in your car? Are you taking a walk? Are you at your kitchen table having breakfast? Maybe you're just like doing some vacuuming and I'm on in the background. You're barely even paying attention. Whatever it is, I really appreciate you being here, and I hope that you're feeling okay. Me, I'm okay. I'm doing all right. Things have continued to go in a decent direction. I'm not complaining. And I did make the infamous appointment to see my doctor about my hip. I'm going this week, so we'll see how it goes. We'll see where it takes me. What else? Oh, you know what else I've been thinking a lot about? And I'm curious if any of you want to reach out to me to respond to this. But I've been really wondering about people's sense of community. Like, whoever you are that's listening to this right now, especially, I guess, if you're a yoga teacher, or even not, even if you're just a yoga practitioner, do you feel like you have a yoga community that you're part of? Maybe that's in person, like you've got a local center you go to, or maybe it's an online thing that you've been going to for a long time, like a teacher or a class that you go to online. You know, it seems like something that people are looking for, and it seems like there's certain types of community you can have online, and then there's certain aspects of community maybe you can have online. I don't know, I guess I've just been thinking a lot about it. I think about how I had the yoga center for 10 years, and in that time, certainly there was community that formed. People met their life partners, and friendships were formed, and all kinds of connections were made. But it was very much about that space. It was about people coming together into that space. It was an actual lease that I had on a space, But when the rents got too high, when I could no longer keep pace with the gentrification, I had to let go of that space. And with that, the community went away. I mean, the connections remain, but the sense of community disappeared. And it was felt. There was a sadness around that. And I suppose the same is true with ongoing Zoom meetings I've been doing for years. I've got my weekly teachers call that I've done for 5+ years at this point, every Thursday. And so that's like an online room, that's an online space where people have come together again and again, and connections have been made there. But if the Zoom meeting were to go away, then the connections would remain. But what happened to the community? Is the community connected to the space that we share? And I think about my neighbor, my next door neighbor here where I live in Easton, Pennsylvania. The other day, my neighbor mowed my lawn for me. I didn't even ask her to do that. She just mowed it without me asking it. And my wife walked out and she said, "Oh, I hope you don't mind. I hope I didn't overstep any boundaries, but I was out here doing mine." And it was so sweet. She just did us a solid, And that's like real community. That's my neighbor. She lives right next to me, and she did me that sweet gesture. But at the same time, I don't know if I could talk to her about like the kind of stuff I talk with my fellow teachers in Teachers Call. I don't know if I could talk to her about radical non-duality. Although, you know what? I bet Annette could probably hang, I've never tried. Who knows? You see, maybe I shouldn't assume too much. But it's just interesting the way there's people who live all over the world in different places who know me quite well, even you, like a regular listener, somebody who listens to this show every week. And there are some of you out there who've listened every week since I started it, over 7 years ago at this point. That's crazy to me. If that's if that's you listening to this right now and you've listened to every episode since I started, in many ways, you know me better. You know more about me. You know what's going on with me more than people who see me every day, or even members of my own family, because I talk about things and share about myself in certain ways doing this show that you just wouldn't ever get to see or hear if you didn't listen to the show. So I don't know, is there a community of listeners? Is there a community of people who've returned to the space of listening to this show every week? I don't know. I don't think there's really a definitive answer to the question. It's just something I've been thinking about. I also will add, I have this online teacher training, and in talking to people about that, people who are considering it, I've heard quite a few horror stories about online teacher trainings, y'all, because sometimes online spaces can be very impersonal, right? It's hard to connect. If we try to pretend there's something they're not, or I think there's good uses for them and maybe not always such good uses for those meetings online. So it's very interesting to me. I'm curious, whoever you are that's listening, if you have a feeling of community around you, and if so, how you define that. And is it online or is it in person? For whatever that's worth, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Just go to the website, go to the contact page, and shoot me a note. I guess I'm reflecting on that a lot because the last few teachers I spoke to, I've recorded a couple conversations for the show, and, I always will often check in with them on, what they've been doing and what their kind of future plans, if they have any, are. And a lot of people have little online communities that they've put together now because over the pandemic, we all jumped online. So you've got like a group of people who are coming to stuff that you're doing online, and very few people seem to have any in-person community. I don't have any in-person community right now. All my stuff's online. I've been trying to drum up some attendance in my classes here in my neighborhood and haven't quite yet, but even still, there's not even centers out there. Like when the world fell apart in 2020, I was like on the road. I was like touring and doing all these in-person events. And I had like a list of at least 30, 40 yoga centers around the world, And that list is pretty much decimated at this point. And there's just not a lot of people out there. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just in a little bubble, and there's plenty of you out there who have a local yoga center and a wonderful, thriving community. And I guess that's what I'm wondering about. And it really ties in to what I think is this kind of trajectory of yoga that I've been following here on the show since I started it. I always talk about it. You've heard me say it a million times, It went into the mainstream, right? And then there's this whole thing that's happened over the last few years where whatever I thought mainstream yoga industry has been completely blown out, and it's kind of a no man's land of sorts. Or you could not think of it that way. You could think of it as a wild, wild west again in certain ways. But this evolution of yoga coming to the West and people like myself embracing it as a life path and like making a living at it, I'm just curious about how other people out there who are in that same boat are managing things. And that is certainly part of today's conversation with Eric Shaw. I know of Eric from a long while back. I remember him being on the scene in parallel to me at a much earlier time in yoga, and I remember him putting out some stuff that I found useful. You'll hear we we reminisce some. And then a few years back, he disappeared from the yoga world, and we discussed that some too. But recently, he self-published a book called Sacred Thread, A Comprehensive Yoga Timeline, 2,000 Dates That Shaped Yoga History. And I must say, this comprehensive timeline of yoga history that Eric put together is illuminating. I learned a bunch of things reading through it, and I just found that it painted a really intricate tableau of this evolution that I'm always talking about. So I really appreciated having this opportunity to talk about some of the things in the timeline and just reflect on how things have gone in the yoga world and how it looks like they're going, kind of. I don't know. In any case, I found the conversation quite stimulating, and I've been thinking a lot about it since. So I really appreciated having it with Eric, and I'm glad to be bringing it to you today. Real quick before we get to that, I do want to take a moment to express my gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. Today, I specifically want to say thanks to Nancy Weinbarger and Paul McCormick. Thanks to you, Nancy and Paul. Appreciate you supporting the show. If you are someone who's been listening to the show and you want to help see it continue and support it and get access to the full archives, the way that you do that is you become a podcast premium subscriber. It's choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. If you don't have any money and there's an old episode that you're really hoping to listen to, don't sweat it. Just email us and we will definitely give you a free account. But if you have a little something to give, it makes a difference, and we really appreciate everyone who does that. To learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or find all my other stuff, ongoing classes, that teacher's call I mentioned, all of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right, y'all. I think that's fine. I will touch base with you on the other side, but for now, let's go ahead and get into this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Eric Shaw. Hello.
Hey, Jay Brown.
Hey, Eric Shaw. What's going on?
Not much. Good to see you.
Good to meet you. We met before, I don't think. Like maybe some shared common threads, like another lifetime ago in the blogosphere days, but I don't think we've ever met in person before, have we? No.
No, I used to be on the conference circuit, but we probably crossed paths in that world.
Yes, we were on that. You kind of got off of it right as I got on it a little bit, but we did. Okay. We were ships passing a little bit at some of the venues on that circuit. I think you're right. Yeah. Well, good to have a moment to speak with you. I know you've listened to the show before, so I am recording already. I like to consider us having begun, just so you know. I don't want that to take you by surprise.
Yeah, that's good. I like the background. It looks like you're sitting in a well-cultured attic.
Well, this is the attic. I talk about the attic on the show all the time. I have a little space around the corner that I share with a photographer. She owns this little space that she uses as a studio. She's actually a boudoir photographer. And she has that space that it's like a little house that was in her family, and she uses it as a studio, but she's only there 2 days a week.
Okay, so is this your house, her house?
It's her house, and it's right around the corner from my house, which I'm in right now. So I rent that space like the 5 days a week she's not there, but today she had clients, so I'm in the attic. So you're not seeing the studio space that I'm often in. You're seeing the attic space, which is where I record all the intros and outros. So people who listen to the show know the attic. That's the background that you're seeing.
It looks like a really fun place to be.
There's like music, there's instruments, and there's books, and this is my, I guess, what you would call man cave, if I have such a thing.
Yeah,
But it's more of like a yogi cave than a man cave in certain regards.
right. That's the right cultural reference.
Well, in any case, Eric, I am glad to get a chance to speak with you. You know, for people who are listening, and then just for you, there is a little bit of context and background to you being here today, other than the recent comprehensive yoga timeline that you put out. Because, you know, for myself, when I first got into yoga, like back in 1995, there weren't a lot of sources of information about stuff. I remember I did my first, I guess it was a teacher training in 1997 with Allison West. Was one of the first ones in New York City that was like a formally 200 hours.
Wow, back in 95.
Yes, but 97 was the training. 97 was the training.
Free Yoga Alliance.
It was right the first year. 97 was like when I think the first year they put out those 200 hours, or she might have been a little bit of preemptive and done her first one before it was even formally announced. But
it was 2000. I could be wrong. I'd love to check that, but
I can't remember. But I know that Allison had been involved in talks, and she did her first training in 97. And it was a formal 200 hour.
Interesting.
And for me, I had already been in her class religiously for several years before she did that. So it was more of like a culmination for me than like the beginning of my training with her. And shortly after that, in 1998, I took a trip to India. I met someone there who planted all these seeds in my head. And when I came back in 1998, I just wanted to like learn more information. I discovered Georg Forstein and got the yoga tradition or whatever. And then I remember being at the library, like trying to find information about Sri Yantra, and like the librarian helping me and like showing me something on like microfiche or something like that, because it was pre-internet and there just wasn't a lot of sources for information about stuff.
Yeah.
So fast forward, 2007, I opened a yoga center in Brooklyn, and I started a yoga teacher training program. And I'm supposed to teach the history and philosophies of yoga. And, you know, in my yoga teacher training, and I think in a lot of yoga teacher trainings, a lot of times history and philosophies of yoga ends up just being Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Like it might have some references to Vedas or Samkhya or other things, but the focus tends to be on sutras, and often not a lot, more on asana, you know, as we both know that happened.
Yeah.
So for me, I wanted to try to know what I was teaching and know what I was talking about, but I'm not very academically minded. Like
right.
I'm analytical and I can grasp concepts, but I'm not like the granular details is not always my strong point. So I made a flow chart, and the flow chart started with a box at the top that said archaic yoga, which was a term I got from Georg Forstein. And it said Indus River Valley civilization, pre-Vedic to Vedic age. And then there was a box underneath that was like the Brahmanical period. And then whatever, like I kind of tried to make these signposts, Samkhya and the Hindu epic narratives and the Pradipika, you know, like just kind of chart them out. And then as you get down, it gets to schools and teachers, and then me at the bottom. So it was like, how do I get from, you know, the Pashputi seals or whatever at the top box to me down here trying to say I'm a yoga teacher?
That sounds like a really fun process and a really great visual project too, to organize that info in your mind. Well done.
Well, that's what I set about doing. And so over the years, I've continued to just try to learn more about all those signposts, because those are like the overarching signposts, but within each of them, there's like lifetimes worth of study potentially, you know?
And not many know that. I mean, at least you know that, right? You know what you don't know. You know something about what you don't know.
Exactly. And I have these memories of you. First memory I have of you is maybe in 2012, which was like at the peak of, you know, power vinyasa craze, where there was commercials, Nike commercials and Reebok commercials with like super hot chicks sweating on their yoga mat. And it was saying, just do it, you know? And I was trying to do something more substantive.
Yeah.
and you had a video, I think on YouTube, talking about the origins of yoga.
Yeah.
And Upanishads or something, but talking about it in a way that wasn't like overly academic in a sense, but like more like, so someone like me, a layman, could grasp it a little bit easier. And I took note of you at that time because of that.
It's interesting what you say, because there's some parallels in my experience too, even in a dialogue with you, because in 2009, I had a big break. Yoga Journal hired me to create just the template that you described making for yourself 2 years earlier. They did a timeline of yoga. It was a graphic exposition over 2 pages, kind of a, you know, the yogi form of the fold out. And that was fun to do. It was fun to work with them and fun to get close to them, and that established a relationship with them. And I have a graphics background, so that was very exciting to me. And I think in terms of timelines, and I think in terms of history. So I got to lay that all out. I don't know if you ever saw that. And then I was doing scholarly work. I was in a PhD program at California Institute of Integral Studies studying the Asian tradition. And it's really good for me to hear your report on what you encountered from what I was putting out, because that was exactly the way I was trying to position myself. I wanted to be the person who knew everything, but who was gonna be the conduit to the popular mind. I was in this scholarly world. I've been there for a long time, and I thought that way and I talked that way, but I was working as hard as I could. I was working really effortlessly to train myself to simplify ideas, to use common language, to connect with the everyday reader. So it's good to hear your report about receiving that. My first encounter with your work, and I can't remember what year it was, but I also recognize an alignment with where I was at, because I was trained with Chandra Remete and his style of vinyasa, which is kind of a multi-directional vinyasa, influenced by Bharatanatyam, Indian dance, and Kalari-Patu, or however you pronounce it, the Indian martial art form. And it had to do with very slow and controlled and complex vinyasa. And I was championing that in my asana teaching, and I noted that you, from your own perspective, which I am guessing is Iyengar, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you have some of that.
Well, eventually it became Desikachar inspired.
And you were articulating the awareness behind it in a way which very much aligned with my understanding and my knowledge of how the mind is trained by somatic processes. So I was fed by your intellectual investigations as well as your somatic investigations. And it was probably around that time, probably around 2012, if not before.
Mm-hmm. Just around that time, we put out a video, and it was like slower is stronger, and it was me doing these simple, slow stuff. I think that's probably what you're talking about. Yeah, I remember that time.
It's a great way to teach. It's the only way I care to teach, really.
Oh, well, it's interesting. I mean, we can get to that. I was actually curious about that because I don't know you as an asana teacher at all. We can come to that because I know you more from this other like scholarly or like history and philosophy perspective. A few other synchronicities leading to this conversation today, like over the last year, even before you sent me this new thing that you put out. I wrote something years ago, 2009, got published in the International Journal of Yoga Therapy. So I have like an Academia EDU account. And, you know, I like to try to keep abreast if anybody puts any new stuff up or new research is coming out or whatever. But the algorithm feeds you. What's that?
Academia EDU, what a great platform for staying up on everything that's the latest, the cutting edge of, you know, yoga information from all over the planet.
Anybody listening to this show who doesn't go on there to read stuff, there's all kinds of great stuff there, you know, but in any case, there's an algorithm that sends me emails. You know, that's initially like if anybody puts anything new, I'll get a notification, but it also like sends me archival stuff that it thinks I'm going to be interested in. So over the last year, I read the thing that you wrote about BKS Iyengar. I read the thing that you wrote about Krishnamacharya. And then when you sent me this new thing, I thought of something else I had saw that you'd done. What was it called? Like something like Connect the Dots biographies. It seemed like that might have been like a little precursor to this. Like, I guess my question is, for people listening, this timeline you put out, I talked about how I have grasped like the overall things, but don't know the details. Yeah. Your timeline's kind of like the inverse in a way. Like it gives me the same feeling like my flow chart does. But what you did is went year by year and just listed all these granular details of things that happened that year.
Yeah.
And my mind was quite blown by like the breadth of it. Like, how long have you been collecting all these little factoids, and have you always had in mind that you were going to put them together into one thing?
Yeah.
Were those connect the dot biographies some of the early work? I guess that's my question.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. And it helps me explain the genesis of the book and its form and how it came together. So it sounds like you and I think a little similarly. I mean, I like to organize things in terms of history and flowcharts and timelines. And I think I always have. I mean, I was in fourth grade, I was a history nut. I read every book in my school library on World War II. I was a little war fanatic, you know. And so I was always thinking in terms of history. I was always drawing maps. I was always a very visual person. You know, I did all these series. I would create my own little wars, you know, as a little kid, fourth grader, you know, and I would describe each detail on each page and describe some new technology that they created, and, you know, huge underground silos with living spaces. And I love detail. So I've always been into the granular side of things ever since I was a little kid. And so when I entered a PhD program at California Institute of Integral Studies in 2004, I wanted to learn the history. I wanted to become a master of yoga history. I'd already done a little bit of work on it, but I had no concept of the breadth of it or the detail of it or really what was happening at all. But as I began to get a hold of that, you know, I think every worthwhile book is a person's own process. It's an attempt to clarify for themselves a certain set of ideas. So for me, I started forming this, you know, this Word document. I started laying out the dates so that I could have it clear in my mind, not really a reference point, but just the fact that I wrote it helped me keep it clear of what I was learning. You know, when did this happen? How did it relate to this? What was happening in a parallel event somewhere else? And I love history, and I have, I think, a very excellent knowledge of world history and global American history. And so I started corroborating it to that. I started putting in American historical events that were, you know, so that I could, you know, kind of bracket in my mind, okay, this was happening when this was happening. Okay, that's really interesting. And in the Asian context, this evolution was occurring, where in the Western context, this evolution was occurring. So that began as a map. I kept adding to it. I eventually threw it on my own website as a document. I sold a bunch of documents on my website. At that point, it was about 40 pages. And at some point, I dropped out of my PhD program, and I thought that wasn't really good for me existentially. I still want to do it, finish the PhD. And I started to look at that document and understand that if I annotated it, made it fuller, it could stand as a dissertation in a British university where they hand out PhDs for just the dissertation work. So I did a bit of exploration about that, of, you know, Commonwealth universities in Canada and Australia and the United Kingdom, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And I thought, Eric, just publish this as a book. Just finish it. Don't worry about the academic side of it. Don't worry about getting any academic credentials out of it. Just make it into a book. So I spent about 9 months expanding it. It got to about 250, I think it's finally 266 pages published. I started exploring all these areas that I hadn't mapped, you know, yoga competitions and certain obscure swamis and other historical figures in America, like Philip Deslepi's work, which I hadn't, you know, fully, you know, digested. So I made this really comprehensive map. And, you know, at some point I just decided, you better publish this thing. It's about complete. I kept thinking it was done and adding more and more and announcing to people it was done, but then adding more. But I'm pretty happy with how it's come out. So yeah, I think it's fairly thorough, and I think it's worthy of its comprehensive in its title.
I mean, it definitely is comprehensive because it's, like I said, a massive list of granular details that do form kind of a picture as you go through it, at least for me. Now, and it's interesting to me because there's a lot of stuff that's just, you know, it's the year this book was published, or even earlier than that, some of the earliest evidences that we have. Where does this come from? You know, where does the first reference to Hatha Yoga or whatever, like all of these.
That's exciting stuff in the Western context when it first got mapped over. I mean, to read when we actually knew about the Yoga Sutras, when someone had read the Yoga Sutras, when actually someone critiqued the Yoga Sutras. When did it start to influence Western philosophers? Because there's a lot of influence there that hasn't been mapped. I think, and it's the East-West thing that really excites me, because I feel like I'm that being, and you are too, I'm sure. We feel like we straddle the two cultures. And so that dialogue, when you go clear back to Alexander and you stuff, and then, you know, the philosophers from the Greek tradition who started to look, you know, they wrote the Indica and all these things, and Megasthenes and all this stuff. They wrote all these, you know, profiles on India. You start to see that dialogue. It's so exciting. It's so exciting to me viscerally to read about that stuff and understand it.
I know. I completely agree. It's quite intriguing. I guess I'm also curious because as I was saying that, as I went through the timeline, there's very obvious things, and then there's just things that struck you, like certain events in history, or certain things, or certain paying note of this particular influencer at a time. Even the fact, and full disclosure, that you included the starting date of this show, which I'm incredibly flattered by. You were really, your description of the show was very complimentary. I was very flattered by that. But for me, you certainly are. There is your vantage point in it. And I think you're right. Me too. I don't know how old you are, but we're similar in age, it seems. And we kind of rode a wave of yoga into the mainstream, as I always talk about on this show. So me even coming into my adulthood in a way parallels the way yoga was in the culture, because I was identifying with yoga so much throughout that time.
Yeah. And that was one of my impetuses for actually getting published too, because I realized, just as you said, I had cataloged a certain historical progression which had key figures which were important to me and my generation, and perhaps your generation. But I also realized that, like every history, prominent figures are transient and forgotten. And so what if I write about certain figures that modern yogis don't know about? This thing's going to become dated. If I don't get it out, it's going to be irrelevant, because a whole new crop of superstars, 10 years down the line, is going to replace the current ones. And what I've written about is, well, who cares about Richard Freeman? Who is Richard Freeman? Why do you tell me about when Richard Freeman was born? Who is this guy? I needed to publish it in my historical moment so it would still have relevance.
It's funny you bring up Richard Freeman, because you also mark the years in which the Yoga Journal conferences happened. And when they first happened, I remember that. And then I remember the last one that happened in New York, where Richard Freeman and Rachel Bray, the Yoga Girl, was there at the same time. And Richard had 12 people and she had 150 or something. And I was amazed. I was I can't believe that Richard can't pack the room.
Wow.
And I guess that is an interesting thing for me, because, like I said, we both rode the wave. And when I remember you were definitely someone, like you said at the beginning of this conversation, on the circuit, and you were definitely doing the yoga career grind, and traveling around and teaching in yoga teacher trainings and stuff.
Yeah. It's all I cared about.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were doing that for some years, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It's been 22 years since I started, but there was about 15 years there where it was my heart, my soul, my life, every waking moment, 24/7, my goals, my only purpose in life.
Right. And you did disappear for a little while, and maybe we could talk about that, because, I as I emailed you, I was almost hesitant to bring it up, because I have a memory of when it happened. I was kind of first getting off of social media, honestly. I had started to get off of social media because it had turned super toxic. And I had a business partner who was just showing me it wasn't doing anything for me, business wise. It was just a suck of my time. So I was getting off of it. And I just remember you being one of the first people who seemed like you got what we call canceled now before we were even calling it that or something entirely, that you posted something on Facebook that some people felt was misogynistic, counter perspective around the Me Too stuff, I guess. And people like, I don't know, then you went away, and I guess I feel compelled to bring it up.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, when you look back on that, do you regret the post? Do you want to say anything about what happened with that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a background. I had a grandfather and even my father who were they were social activists. You know, I come from a family of ministers. My mother and father were both ministers. All the way down the line on my father's side, ministers. And it's West Coast. So, you know, I don't know, what your listener base is. I'm now in the South, and it's a completely different religious world, but they were radical liberals. You know, my grandfather got kicked out of pulpits for preaching against the Vietnam War and Pentagon expenditures and what. My father, wrote op-ed articles, about, against the Bushes and all this stuff. So I came from this radical liberal background, very much invested in politics and social action. And because it came from a religious orientation rather than a political orientation, really, it had a lot to do with truth. Like, what is truth? What's the nature of truth? And do you have the integrity to abide by truth? Whatever form it takes, Christianity, Confucianism, Republicanism, whatever, but where is truth? I feel like my parents gave me a dose of that, and my grandfather really gave me a dose of that. So I don't regret that post because I feel like it was truth. I definitely said it in a way that was aggressive and meant to be aggressive. There's a part of me that's a real trickster that likes to stir the beehive, that likes to, if someone's going to get triggered, I want to trigger them. I want to create dialogue. I want to point out the weakness in arguments. The other background to that people probably intuited is that, I've had some rough handling by the feminist cadre, and that began really with my mother, who was a feminist pioneer in her work. And so I grew up, being taught that, told that men were shit and, women were perfect. And there's a lot of that in the yoga world. And I, at some point, created a polemic which presented the other side of the coin, and with no explanation. And that's, that was part of the alchemy of it all, is that I wrote something very potent and aggressive, I think true, but not diplomatic, and not making any attempt to make nice. And I frankly thought it would just go away. I thought, we'll have a little tussle. It'll be kind of fun. We'll trade some ideas. People might get a little upset, but it became atomic, and that shocked me. And it was unbelievably painful, Jay. I mean, it was deeply, deeply painful. It destroyed my identity. I lost 90% of my friends. The yoga world, I felt, didn't step up to the plate and interact with it in a gracious way. And I know that may sound like I'm being hypocritical because I wasn't all that gracious, but in my comments, I said, okay, here's this thing, and I'm willing to discuss it graciously and intellectually, and not a lot of that came back to me. But.
Well, I mean, I know, I remember when you posted it, or when it happened, and I read it, and I remember for myself, I've certainly, at that time, again, there's a time that I think of as a more innocent time on the internet and on Facebook, where I was putting out really provocative titles to just get people talking, you know what I mean? To just provoke, to kind of get people mad and up in arms, and to get something. I remember feeling like I wanted people to have a conversation. So I would, I remember I wrote a thing about how life coaching was bullshit or whatever, and people got mad, and it started a whole thing, So,
and there's some fun in that, right?
There was, and it was an adrenaline pump, and there was all kinds of stuff that, I mean, it came back to bite me too, Eric. It was it wasn't a great, because that platform, the social media platforms, is not an appropriate place to do it, you know what I mean? And when the algorithms change, and when that atmosphere or whatever, where that changed. And I would also say to you that it's also had to do with the changing conversation in the yoga world that was happening. And as we've talked about on the show some recently, the bringing of politics into the yoga spaces and how that was being brought in, you know?
Yeah. And that's something that I'm, aware of, and I have mixed feelings about. I mean, it's good to improve the world. That's why, it's a raison d'etat for any, I think, fully whole human being. I think there's really some interesting information out there about how our evolution of culture has gone in some strange directions now. And I feel like the left has kind of dropped the mantle. I feel like some ways the left was always the leading edge of evolution in world culture, but it's kind of bifurcated into tribalization and opposition, and it's not bringing us together. I think whatever is evolutionary brings us more together as people. And so yoga's adopted form of politics, I feel like, is often devolutionary. So I'm not as aligned with it as I formerly was. I feel like the left has very much betrayed many of its core values that were unitary. And that's, I think, problematic. I don't know how deep you want to get into the weeds about that.
No, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I agree. I feel like there's a feeling of like illiberalism on the left, which I've just not seen in my lifetime before. That puts me in a strange place. I feel like my sense of political alignment hasn't changed, but like all of the calculus around me seems to have, which is a strange feeling. But what I would say for me in our context of this conversation is that the role of yoga practice in the culture is changed. I mean, in relationship to that, not so much for me, because I got into it before the internet and when it was still about some kind of mystical inner peace inquiry, not a fitness regime yet.
Or not a mindfulness regime.
Or not even about mindfulness.
Not so bad, which is kind of, meditation light. It's kind of transcendence light, but it's definitely a good movement. But you're right. Yeah, it kind of is devolved to fitness dramatically.
And I guess for me, in terms of like, frankly, not wanting to get into the politics of this moment so much necessarily, but to kind of frame it in the way that's been more useful to me in terms of just my own practice and yoga inquiry is that a lot of the kind of divergences I have with people, even on a political frame, has to do with the viewpoint about reality. It has to do with a materialistic or reductionist viewpoint about reality in comparison to like a yoga conception of reality that's consciousness based or energy based.
Right.
I mean, I'm even thinking about one of the things you pointed out in your timeline is when the church said that reincarnation was heresy.
Yeah.
Like those little moments like stood out to me in the timeline that there's something for me right now where so much of what we were doing in 2012 was about, like you said, how do I bring this to the mainstream? How do I talk about the history and philosophies of yoga in a way that's accessible? And it was about making a career or a livelihood at it.
Yeah, we had those discussions.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me to note in your timeline, like so many of the things that we talk about now in terms of it being a fitness regime, that happened way back when, in like whenever, the 30s or whatever, when they first were combining physical fitness with yoga.
Or elements of it in the 1840s.
A lot of the kind of conversations we have now when we talk about, oh, that's not real yoga, like it doesn't have any ancient roots or like any historical roots. A lot of it does, it seems like.
Yeah, but I think if we kind of take this full circle between those two things you pointed to, what we see is a reductionism, and it's nothing. There's nothing wrong with asana. There's nothing wrong with fitness. There's nothing wrong with somatic awareness. I mean, it's the path. It's the yogi path to transcendence. But it's the kind of desiccation of the practice. It's the drying up of, if I can use a loaded term, of the religious sensibility or the transcendent capacities of yoga. And it's that mission of yoga, which is so much a greater mission than any political mission, because it's a unifying mission. It's how do I find the same consciousness that you and I share, maybe for the purpose of social building, but more, I think I would definitely think of it in terms of individual terms. How do I evolve as an individual so I can serve the world spontaneously and reflexively? But those religious elements have dropped out of culture generally. I mean, it's not just in the yoga practices, but Christianity has become so much weaker, and any kind of religious perspective in the political conversation that's not rabid and right wing, I would suggest, has dropped out of the conversation. So we don't have a unifying philosophy as a people anymore. Even the sense of America as a joined project that we're all in together is weakened. So yoga is in some ways becoming political, is contributing to the kind of conflicting instincts of our society, rather than bringing us together as a religion does.
Well, wait a second. I would say, though, in my experience, a lot of people on an individual level, particularly people who engage practice like on a personal practice, sometimes maybe not going to yoga classes, but people have experiences of what you're describing. Like, practice has an effect on people's systems and on their experience when engaged wholeheartedly and with like a true intention. And so there's something to me that is quite magical or mystical or universal about it. And when you talk about the religious aspect, that's something I've been talking a lot about on this show. I got to yoga in a way as a rejection of the like organized Judeo-Christian religion of my parents. But when I look at what it is like on a somatic level, the best way I could describe it is prayer, or like maybe it's contemplative prayer. Friar Richard Rohr, if I was just watching a video with that guy recently talking about contemplative prayer. And to me, like, that is more what I think yoga practice has taught me. And that is where yoga practice really helps me, and is absolutely something that the culture or like mainstream yoga, because it wasn't as marketable or because it's subversive. It calls into question the worldview of that's predominant.
Yeah, and I might say it's equally marketable. I think anything is marketable. It's just what is the zeitgeist of the times. We've just moved on to a new sense of who we are as individuals, and it is much more tied up with demographic identity, and that mitigates against any unitary philosophy. We're not trying to be unified. We're trying to be different. We're trying to be Black people or white people or women or men or whatever.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.